want to welcome you to the Virginia MRC 2020 Election Infection Prevention Ambassadors Training. Today, we have presenters and moderator, Jessica Bowman with us. She's the Chief Deputy Department of Elections. Jennifer Goodnight, who is a volunteer from the Northwest region. Jennifer Freeland, who's our State Volunteer Coordinator for Virginia. And Pam Kelpak, she is a nurse out of Peninsula as a volunteer there, and she will be answering questions through the chat box. So what are we going to cover today? One, we're going to talk about the purpose of the Virginia MRC during the elections, polling location operations, election regulations, role of the Infection Prevention Ambassador, infection prevention, education, and strategies, and then communication guidelines and your responsibility as a volunteer. So why use MRCs in election? We're going to show a quick video here. So let me share my screen. And if Jennifer Freeland, if you could give me a thumbs up if you see my screen, just want to make sure. Thank you.
The Virginia Medical Reserve Corps is putting the call out for volunteers to help keep voters safe and healthy when they head to the polls for this month's primary and for November's presidential election. NBC 29's Matt Tallhelm has the details from his home studio.
The Medical Reserve Corps that serves the Thomas Jefferson, Central Shenandoah, and Lord Fairfax health districts nearly doubled its number of registered volunteers to 1,750 since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. Now it's recruiting even more volunteers to serve as infection prevention ambassadors on Election Day. The pandemic is pressuring poll workers to focus on the vote and the virus.
How do we make sure that they're all following the right procedures, know what to do, and that somebody in the precinct is paying attention to that item all during the day?
Louisa County enlisted 6 volunteers from the Medical Reserve Corps for May's local election. They helped the county develop protocols to minimize the risk of spreading COVID-19 at the polls.
Having that extra set of eyes we thought was very helpful and put a little less pressure on our election officers so they could concentrate on what they're doing, even with the new procedures that they had to learn.
The Corps is looking for more volunteers to become election infection prevention ambassadors. They'll train poll workers on proper use of personal protective equipment, monitor social distancing, and help with sanitation and disinfecting.
They're not there to really tell people what to do or enforce anything. They're more as somebody who you can ask if you have questions.
Fluvanna County hopes to have the ambassadors at each of its 6 precincts for the June 23rd primary.
It's monumental to having the elections go along smoothly. It certainly will take a burden off of the officers of elections.
The Corps is already preparing to deploy its election ambassadors again in November.
It's all these small little steps that we think will help provide additional safety for both our workers and the voters.
Election officials are encouraging as many people as possible to vote absentee instead of in person. The deadline to request a mailed absentee ballot is coming up next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Now, if you're interested in becoming a Medical Reserve Corps volunteer, we have a link to sign up with this story at NBC29.com. In my home studio, Matt Tallhelm, NBC 29 News.
And now I'll turn it over to Jessica Bowman from Department of Elections.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Bowman, the Chief Deputy Commissioner at the Virginia Department of Elections. Thank you for having me here today. I also want to thank you for your time and taking the opportunity to volunteer. We really, really appreciate you making the voting process a safe one here in the Commonwealth. My presentation is pretty short today since it is a beautiful Saturday morning, and hope you can enjoy the sunshine afterward. So we're just going to go through a few basic things about elections. So what elections are being held June 23rd? And these are primary elections, so where the parties choose their nominee to be on the ballot in November. So everywhere in the Commonwealth, there is a Republican primary for United States Senate. In some districts, there are congressional primary elections, some only Republicans, some only Democrat, and some both. Virginia has an open primary system. So there is no such thing as a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, a registered independent. Anyone can vote in primaries. If a polling place has both a Democrat ballot, they can choose. I say this because some voters get upset that they have to say that choice out loud, but we got to know what ballot to give them. Next slide. So when you get there, who is in a polling place? Each polling place must have 3 officers of election. So there will be at least 3 people there. There could be more people. Some precincts, in light of COVID-19, have put everyone in one physical location, such as a big high school gymnasium. They can do this, but those spaces must be separate, and each precinct must have at least 2 unique officers of election. They can share others. There's at least a chief and an assistant chief election officer in each precinct. These workers are experienced. They're in charge of the precinct. They bring the supplies, they open the doors, and they speak directly with the General Registrar's office in case anything goes wrong, or just to check in. Others that you will see at the polling place and what they're doing, some people do these in shifts. So one person may come in the morning, one in the afternoon. Some people just stay there all day. You may have a greeter at the door telling people where to go or what to do. You'll have someone checking them in, either on a computer, a tablet, or paper. You'll have someone giving them a ballot. You'll have someone in charge of the machines where you put your ballot, the scanner. We do have a high school page program, so you may see some high school students helping out. Electoral board members, they can go and observe what's happening or checking in to make sure everything is going well. They're responsible for the election. You also may have party observers inside the polling place, just observing activities or the voters coming in. Candidates and parties can be outside of a polling place. Hopefully all of you have been to vote before, and you'll see those people outside handing you flyers or sample ballots. They do have to be 40 feet outside the door, so they can't be right when you walk in. We have consulted with the parties and asked them to wearing, but we
Hi, Jessica. I think your mic has frozen. And your video.
Can you hear me?
Okay, now we can. We can hear you now.
Okay, next slide. So timeline of election day, officers arrive at 5 a.m.
Sorry.
They, the polls open at 6 a.m. They close at 7 p.m. If you have a line at 7 p.m., they can vote. They just have to stay in line. The peak times are opening, closing, and lunch. So that's when most people go to vote. So the voting process, it's pretty simple. A voter enters a polling place, they check in. Like I said earlier, it's on a poll book, so that can be a computer, tablet, or paper. They ask for photo ID. A voter gets a ballot, they mark their ballot, they go to the voting tabulator, insert it, they get an I voted sticker, and they leave. So there's been a lot of creativity in polling places due to COVID-19. So here are some things you may see in the polling place you're assigned that doesn't normally happen, or that you may never have seen before when you go vote. So some polling places have made an all drive-through voting or expanded drive-through voting. So you can vote in your car if you want to, or some, I know Williamsburg, for instance, you know, that's the default. You just drive through a fire station kind of garage and vote your ballot. There's been safeguards put in place for exchange of photo ID. So some people are doing it on clipboards with clothespins, so they don't have to touch a photo ID or interact in that way. You may see sneeze guards, shower curtains we've seen around check-in tables, disposable pens and folders. So folders to keep your ballot secret. Pens, you just take them with you, which is unusual. You would usually leave them in the voting booth. Some people sadly have decided not to do I voted stickers, but that's very rare because people, that's their favorite part of voting a lot of times. You may see a limit of the number of people inside a polling location, and you'll see social distance signage for voters standing in line. So you can see on the screen that these were the supplies that we gave to localities. So everyone has these at least. A lot of localities have sourced other PPE and cleaning supplies from their local government. So everyone has masks, gloves, face shields, hand sanitizers, disinfectant and micro wipes to wipe down everything and wipe down voting machines, disposable pens and folders, as I said earlier. With masks, some have ordered extra for voters, some have collected them, like the fabric mask. So you may see those there offering them to voters who do not have a mask. So voters wearing masks. As everyone knows, the governor has an executive order requiring masks in a lot of places. However, we cannot turn a voter away because they're not wearing a mask. There is a constitutional right to vote, and they have that right regardless. So if a voter is not wearing a mask, you can ask them if they have one. Maybe they left it in their car, if they would wear it. You can offer them a mask if extra are available, as I mentioned earlier. You also may ask them just to vote outside, either in their car or at a table or something, so they're not in the polling place. But no matter what those options are, you want the interaction from a health point of view and a voting process to be as brief as possible. So if someone's refusing to wear a mask and you ask them, hey, will you vote outside? They say no. Do you have a mask? No. Then it's easier just to get them in, get them out, and go about their business. Key things to remember. If you have any questions or concerns, please ask. Number one, you can always talk to your chief election officer or whomever she is designated as your contact. Voters can get agitated for a variety of reasons. This is a public process. Election officials are trained for it. They've usually been doing this for a while, and they're trained for a variety of situations. Elections are administered in a nonpartisan manner. So if things are slow, if there's no one coming, it's really easy to just start talking about politics and who the candidates are, et cetera. We would ask you refrain from doing that. And then if for some reason you can't make your volunteership, please communicate that to your designee ASAP. This will help general registrars and officers of election alter plans while still making the process go smooth. So that's it. I see a quick question. So photo ID laws, you may have heard a bunch about new election laws on the news the past couple of weeks. All of those start July 1st. So everything you've heard on the news won't be in effect till November. Also, I will give a plug. If you yourself want to vote and you're not going to be at your polling location on election day, you can vote absentee. You need to apply for your ballot by this Tuesday, June 16th. So you are allowed to do that online. And once again, thank you so much for your time. And I will be answering election questions that we will be putting on an FAQ page in the coming days.
Thank you, Jessica. And now we'll turn the presentation over to Jennifer Goodnight.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the role of the Infection Prevention Ambassador, or IPA. My name is Jennifer. I've been an MRC volunteer throughout Northern Virginia for a few years now. And I'm also a master's in public health and a certified safety professional. So I'm very well versed in OSHA guidance and other workplace safety. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat and we'll address questions at the very end. So the main role of the IPA is to assess and reduce the infection risk for both workers at the voting location and for voters. So you want to look and determine what actions, preferably relatively easy actions, the workers can take to minimize the infection risk, both before the voters arrive and during the day as voters vote. When I was last at an election, we noticed a couple of things that could be improved over the course of the day. And so we decided to change a couple of things as more voters came in. And I found it really valuable also to arrive before the voters did. So unfortunately, the voters start arriving at 6 a.m., as Jessica said. So that can be a little bit early, but it was nice to be able to get there before the big rush and assess things. So you also want to identify challenges and bring feedback back to the MRC. As Jessica talked about, this is a little bit of a trial run in June for the big November election. We'll probably see even bigger numbers in November, and therefore it's good to bring back what challenges you face and what suggestions you have for the future. Next slide, please. So before voting day, what can be done? So if possible, if you know your building, it's good to think about the layout. We'll talk a little bit about traffic flow in a minute, but think about where voters are going to be, where voters are going to wait, how voters are going to exit, and what are the best ways to improve social distancing. For ventilation, that's also something that would ideally be addressed before voting day. You want to maximize fresh air and air circulation. Many of you have probably seen the guidelines from CDC that fresh air is helpful when you have to be inside of a building. And you also want to consider weather. In June, if it's very, very hot, people may not want to prop the doors open. If it's raining, people may not want to prop the doors open. In November, we may have a really strong cold day, and that may not be a good day to prop the doors open. But think about these preferably before voting day to try and consider what you can do. Next slide, please. You also want to think about cleaning solutions. So the voting workers are going to take care of the cleaning solutions. They've been provided a list, but it would be a good idea for you to be familiar with CDC's list of approved solutions and approved cleaning materials for COVID. So when you get to the polling station, you can be ready to look at what solutions are going to be used to clean. Are they well labeled? And you also want to be familiar with what things like hand sanitizer need to have. So I don't know if you all have heard, but with the supply chain issues, some hand sanitizer has been manufactured very quickly. Breweries, for example, are starting to manufacture hand sanitizer. The problem with that is that sometimes they don't add the things that help make the solution not very irritating to your hands. They might not be able to add aloe or some of the other additives. And they also might not be able to add thickening agents. And therefore, the solution may be very wet, almost similar to water, and maybe very messy and difficult to use. So be familiar with what solutions are best so that you can look at what cleaning products your team is given when you get there on voting day. Next slide, please. Okay, traffic flow. So ideally, we'd like to have one-way traffic flow through the voting area. That means people come in through one door, probably from the parking lot. They go to the voting area, they wait in an area, they vote in that area, and then preferably they exit out a different door, walk down a different hallway, and out to the same parking lot. So ideally, this is a one-way flow. Nobody has to pass anybody else going in versus going out. Some buildings that won't be possible, but if this is possible, it will be a great thing to set up. And that may involve propping open some doors or directing people to go a way that they may not expect to be going. In my building, we had to open the back door and direct people around the corner. Could you go back? Thank you. You also want to think about maintaining 6 feet. Of course, we've all heard about the social distancing guidelines, but they get a little bit complicated when you have people waiting in line. So you can, of course, put tape down on the floor. You also may use cones to tell people where to stand. You can also use cones to potentially mark pathways. For our area, one of the things that we noticed as our voters came to vote is one of our tables was in the middle of the gymnasium where we were voting, and you could walk either way around the table, but one way around the table, you weren't able to maintain social distancing very easily. The other way is where we wanted voters to go. So we started marking the pathway with the cones. You also want to think about the workers. Many of these workers have been working at these same polling locations for years, and they know each other very well. So when I got there, I noticed a lot of the worker chairs were close together because they wanted to talk and hang out for the day because there are slow periods. But it's good to remind them that you should space out their chairs and that if they want to talk and sit next to each other, that's fine, but they should sit at least 6 feet apart. That also means that if you have 2 workers doing the same task, like 2 workers are both taking identifications, then they need to be spaced out as well, which means you may need separate tables for something that they would traditionally only have one table for. So that's worth thinking about and suggesting as well. You also want to think about what you would do if you have many voters waiting. Again, June is going to be likely less voters in line than November. So think about if you suddenly had a bunch of voters come, what would you do with them? Would they vote or would they wait inside or would they wait outside? And consider the weather. If you're asking people to wait 6 feet apart on a very rainy day, that might be a problem. So are there alternate areas where the people could vote? Wait before they vote. In my area, we had an entrance straight away to the area where you vote, the gymnasium, but there was a big hallway where if it was raining, we could have people space out and wait there and mark X's in that hallway if people didn't want to wait outside in the rain. Next slide, please. You also want to think about shared spaces. So many of these voting workers are going to be there from 4 or 5 a.m. until sometimes 8 or 9 or even 10 p.m. And so they have a very long day ahead of them. They need to use the restroom, they need to use the water fountains or the break rooms, they need to eat meals. So think about what spaces those workers are going to share with each other. Ideally, you could have 2 sets of restrooms and suggest that some workers go to one set, some workers go to another, to minimize the possibility that 2 workers are going to the restroom at the same time. Because the restroom could be a spot where you could potentially take off your mask if you need a break. The water fountains, again, hopefully there's multiple, or people could wipe them down between each use. Break rooms, unfortunately, again, many of these workers want to eat together. They talked with me the day that I was there about wanting to, break bread and get together and catch up with each other, because they often see each other every couple of months and have done so for years. We'll talk a little bit about food safety in those break rooms, but think about maybe suggesting that people take breaks at spaced times, especially if they're going to want to take off their mask during those break times, because it is difficult to wear a mask for 10 hours straight. So think about what are the areas where they could take breaks. Are there rooms that are spaced apart from each other where 2 people who want to go on break at the same time could potentially go? And are there any other spaces that you should consider, or shared areas that the workers are going to all be using together? At my area, there were about 10 workers. And so if they were all crowded into the same break room, that could potentially be an infection risk. Next slide, please. Okay, day of. Let's talk about some of the options that you have for operations. So this is a great picture here of possible barriers. So Jessica mentioned the possibility of shower curtains or these stand-up plastic barriers. At my location, they have the stand-up barriers, and you can see in the picture here, the chairs were somewhat close together because people are used to having their chairs right next to each other. So it's a good idea to remind them to spread those chairs apart and maybe move the barriers as well, because people are going to remember to sit behind the barriers. If the barriers are 6 feet apart from each other, then they'll remember to sit 6 feet apart from each other. But those barriers are really useful because if you have somebody on the other side, they can hand you their license. My place used a little plastic bucket, like a small one that you could put your license in and slide it underneath the barrier. And then the worker on the other side can take out the identification, verify it, look on their computer, and then hand it back to the person under the barrier. And it's ideal to have a barrier at this time because these tables aren't necessarily 6 feet wide. And there may be complicating factors due to voting that cause the person to be standing at that area for a little while. So, for example, if somebody registered to vote absentee but actually decided to vote in person that day, they're supposed to bring their absentee ballot and they need to have that ballot verified. So they would be sliding that ballot underneath the barrier as well. So think about opportunities for barriers. We also had barriers for the person who was handing out the actual ballots. He had a barrier between himself and others. You want to think about, in general, minimizing the voting stations. Now, unfortunately, this may cause traffic issues, so this is a little bit of a balance. At my place, we had about a huge gym, and we only had about 5 voting locations because they had to be 6 feet apart. This, again, may cause some backups, so it's worth it to think about how to balance this. But you want to maximize the space between stations if at all possible. And in general, minimize person-to-person contact. I'll talk a little bit more about some other strategies in a minute. Next slide, please. So think about how to minimize what surfaces are commonly touched. With those barriers, we actually place the barriers on the far end of the table, closest to the voter, because that way somebody wouldn't be tempted to put all of their stuff down on the table in front of them. So if the space is in front of the polling worker, then that person can maintain their space and their distance, and the voter is much more likely to keep their purse and their phone and other things with them on them so they don't set them down. So that's one way to discourage people from putting their things down on the tables. You also want to think about other surfaces that might be commonly touched. Jessica mentioned pens. Having those be a one-way transaction is a good idea. Giving them pens, they walk away with them. And you also want to think about other surfaces that might be touched, like doors. When I walked into my polling location, the door was a handle door. There was no automatic feature that you had to grab and open every time somebody wanted to come in. So that would be a door handle that could potentially get contaminated. So think about, could you prop open those doors? If you can't for some reason, maybe a weather-related reason or a building safety reason, then think about maybe having a door monitor, somebody who stands outside the door and opens it for everybody, so not everybody is touching that same handle all day long, hundreds of people. Next slide, please. So what are the tools that we have for infection prevention? So Jessica mentioned a few of these: masks or face shields. So OSHA came out with guidance this week that if somebody can't wear a mask, a face shield is a potential alternative. Preferably, we have people in both masks and face shields, but you may get questions from people asking if they can wear their mask, or why they have to wear their mask, and or if they can take it off at certain points. I generally prefer a mask and a face shield, but if they absolutely cannot wear a mask for some reason, at least have them in a face shield. You also have those barriers. Signs are another tool that can be used. So signs are a good way to set a social norm for wearing masks. If you set a sign outside the building and you have signs coming in the building about wearing masks and social distancing, then people know what to expect. And I believe the polling workers will generally bring these signs with them and post them, but they're a good thing to check out when you get on site. Gloves are another option. I'll talk about gloves in a minute because obviously there is limited supply of gloves, but they can be used, and they're especially useful for people who need to touch surfaces that the voters are touching, like identifications, for example, or the people who are going out to the cars to help voters vote and might have a clipboard. Hand washing areas are another tool. So when you get to your building, make sure you check out where the nearest hand washing station is. Sometimes these polling areas get very busy, and if you point that station out to the workers, they'll know where it is and they can take a chance or take a quick moment to go wash their hands rather than having to look for the nearest one. Hand sanitizer is another option if somebody doesn't have time to wash their hands between every interaction, which is very likely. Hand sanitizer is a potential option. Obviously, it's better to wash your hands every time, but hand sanitizer is an option. And Clorox or other wipes may be an option too. I'll talk a little bit about cleaning each station and why I recommend paper towels versus the wipes, but Clorox might be an idea for wiping down the tables at the end of the day, for example, if you have that available. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit about masks. So the purpose of masks, as you all are probably aware, is for the non-medical cloth style mask that CDC recommends. The purpose of that is to protect others from you. If you are ill and asymptomatic or ill and don't know it yet, this mask can help that spread of respiratory droplets. So this COVID-19 spreads through respiratory droplets. It's not the kind of virus that can spread 40 feet away from someone and float in the air. You can think of kind of how, if you've ever seen those pictures of someone sneezing and it's next to sunlight where you can see all the little droplets, that's about how it spreads. So it does spread a little bit away from someone, especially if they're coughing or sneezing. But also if someone is talking, they give off respiratory droplets. So it's a good idea to wear a mask to make sure those respiratory droplets don't reach somebody who's next to you. What type of masks should you wear? That partially depends on your personal preference, but ideally, please follow CDC's guidance. So CDC's guidance for mask selection is you want to have a mask that's at least 2-ply, preferably 2 different materials. 3-ply is even better, but obviously the more you add, the more difficult it is to breathe through and the more difficult it can be to wear all day. When I got to my polling station, there was one of the workers there who had this great looking mask. It had all these extra filters. It looked really fancy. But within 10 minutes of wearing it, he was pulling it off his face and trying to breathe through it. And eventually I just asked him, why don't you just switch to another mask? Because this isn't protecting you and this isn't protecting others when you just keep pulling it off over and over again. So it may be a good idea for people to consider balancing the protective factor versus the wearability. You also want to think about communicating about masks to voters. Jessica brought this up a little bit too. I think signage is a great way to do that. The other reason it's really important for your workers to wear masks at all times, even if they're spread out, because CDC has said masks and social distancing both need to be happening, not one or the other. So even if your workers are spread out, they should be wearing their masks at all times, except when they're on a break or at another time when it's appropriate to take off their masks. And that's partially because you want to set the social norm. If people walk into a voting area and they see that every single worker there has a mask on, they're going to be more likely to put their mask on because that's what's normal. But if they see that other people don't have their masks on, they're not going to care as much about it. So that's one way to set the social norm, as well as signage. And as Jessica mentioned, you can potentially bring up to voters, hey, could you please put a mask on? That depends on your personal level of comfort. Of course, Jessica said, voters may be uncomfortable, and we don't ever want to put ourselves in a situation where we're uncomfortable or we're making other people uncomfortable. So there are gentle ways. If you feel comfortable, you can bring up masks to voters. But as Jessica said, we cannot force anyone away because they are not wearing a mask. And we also want to talk about proper wearing and removal of masks. So make sure, I have a mask with me here, make sure it covers your nose. A lot of people want to wear the masks like this because it's a little bit more comfortable, and that's just not the right way to wear them. So make sure they do cover your nose. And when you put them on, use the ear loops to put them on, and try not to touch the front or the back of the mask, because theoretically these could be, especially the front, potentially contaminated. So when you put it on with the ear loops, and when you take it off with the ear loops and set it down somewhere. Next slide, please. Gloves. So gloves are an interesting issue because they can help not get contamination on your skin, but it's very difficult. If you've ever worn gloves for 3 or 4 hours at a time, it's not comfortable. Your hands get all sweaty. It's not very fun to do. But one of the advantages of gloves is that they can help you remember not to touch your face, because the whole goal of hand washing and preventing infection is to make sure that somebody doesn't touch their hand on something and then touch their face. And we touch our faces hundreds of times a day without realizing it. So gloves can actually help you think before you touch your face, oh, I've got a glove on. I shouldn't, rub my nose, or I shouldn't adjust something on my face. So that's one potential benefit of gloves that people don't often think about, along with just making sure that you don't get contamination on your skin. What gloves to wear? Gloves will be provided. I generally suggest nitrile instead of latex because a lot of people can develop allergies to latex over time. But I've also seen other gloves like neoprene, for example. Basically anything that prevents something from getting onto your skin directly and reminds you not to touch your face. Another interesting thing I wanted to bring up is when to wear gloves and how many to wear. So the people who are handling items that the voters definitively need to touch, like their own identification, those are good people to wear gloves. But they don't have to wear 2 gloves. And this can help with our supply chain issues, as well as with general comfort of wearing gloves. So at my polling station, the people who sat behind the barriers and took people's identification wore a glove in one hand, maybe their non-dominant hand, to look at the identification, and then used a non-gloved hand to type on the computer to look the person up, or to grab their cell phone or their book if it was a slow period. And that way they had one potentially contaminated hand and one non-contaminated hand. Somebody who was walking out to the car may do the same thing. If they have a clipboard with all the items the voter needs, then you can have one contaminated hand holding the clipboard and taking it back from the voter, another hand that's potentially not contaminated. And of course, once you remove gloves, it's ideal to immediately wash your hands, but for somebody who's going to be taking identification after identification after identification and doesn't get a break in between each one, that's a great time for them to wear that glove to remind themselves that that hand is contaminated. So you want to coach people on how to properly remove gloves when you get there. A lot of people have not heard of how to properly remove a glove. So if you have 2 gloved hands, there's a different procedure for if you have 1. So if you have 2 gloved hands, you want to, instead of taking your hand and doing this on your first glove, this hand is contaminated, you want to actually grab at the palm and pull the glove off this way, because this is contaminated and your fingers are. If you do this, you're going to get a nice smear right at your wrist. So take this first glove off. Now this hand has a glove on and is holding the other glove. And then you want to take this clean hand and slide it under that last glove. And then you can flip them inside out and dispose of them. For people who are wearing gloves all day, they're going to need breaks. They should take off their gloves, wash their hands, and then come back. So if you only have 1 gloved hand, you can just go straight to sliding underneath that glove with your clean hand and flipping it inside out. People do not need to reuse gloves. That's not a good idea when they're going to take breaks, but they do need to be mindful of the supply concerns. Next slide, please. So opportunities to minimize touch. So I talked a little bit about the licenses and identification and how you can use gloves, since you do have to handle those, or the workers do have to handle those. But there are other ways to think of one-way transactions. So the I voted stickers Jessica talked about a little bit. My station or my polling place did choose to continue using them. And so what they did is they cut the I voted stickers out beforehand and put them on a table pretty well spaced from each other. And then they wiped down that table every once in a while, just to make sure that people were not pulling from the same pile and potentially touching the same item. So that's a good way to make it a one-way transaction. And you're not handing, or the worker is not handing them the I voted sticker, they're picking it up off of a table. Pens we talked about a little bit, and then think about what other papers the person might have to keep, like the folders we discussed. Instead of taking items back and reusing them, unfortunately, we do need to hand people their items so that they can keep them to minimize infection risk. Ballots were another opportunity to minimize touch. So the ballots themselves, if you've ever been to a voting station, oftentimes a worker would take the ballot from you and put it into the machine. And we decided that the best way to handle this was to have a voting worker standing next to the machine and verifying that people put their own ballots in correctly and helping them if they had trouble. So that way they never had to touch the ballot. They didn't really even have to touch the voting machine unless there was trouble. And that was an easy way to verify, again, a one-way touch. Once that person got their ballot, they would put it in the machines themselves. And I'll talk about how to deal with the ballots at the end of the day in a minute. And also think about those clipboards for those in cars. When somebody takes a clipboard out to help somebody who's voting in a car, that clipboard is going to come out or come back with the ballot. The voting worker can put the ballot in for them. But that clipboard might potentially be a surface that you could wipe down with a wipe, or if you're using it frequently, just consider it potentially contaminated. You can also think about gloves for this scenario. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. At my station, we only had a couple of people going out to those in cars, and so that was an opportunity where someone could set the clipboard down, deal with the ballot, and then immediately go wash their hands, and they did not have trouble washing their hands after every one of those interactions. Next slide, please. Okay, cleaning and safety. So we talked about what solutions are used that could be acceptable. There's alcohol-based solutions are usually pretty easy to use. Bleach solutions tend to be a little bit more corrosive, although they're technically acceptable with CDC as well. And paper towels versus wipes. I prefer to spray down the station when I'm cleaning it and then wipe it with a paper towel, because then you can see what you've sprayed down and what you haven't. With a wipe, like a Clorox wipe, it's kind of hard to tell what you've cleaned and what you haven't already. So I prefer using paper towels and using a spray solution. I believe most people will come with the spray bottles as opposed to a bunch of Clorox wipes. How often should you clean is a little bit, it's difficult to answer, because that will depend on the flow of people that are going through your polling station. For us, we had enough personnel there that we were able to assign somebody who was not doing very much already the duty of cleaning after voters as much as possible. So what he would usually do is watch and see how the voting was looking, and then take the opportunity to clean all the stations as often as he could. So I'd probably say he averaged cleaning, since we only had a few voters going through every couple of minutes, about every 10 minutes or so. But you do have to be mindful of your supplies. It's of course ideal to clean after each voter, but that may not be possible, especially if you have a long line waiting. So clean as often as possible, make it visible that somebody is cleaning. Make sure that it's done pretty thoroughly. But if you have two voters who go back to back, don't beat yourself up that you didn't clean after every single voter, because it is going to be difficult. But try and do it as often as you can to make sure that the space stays clean. And as Jennifer is saying, the best protection is indeed for everyone to wash their hands, including the voters, and hopefully they know that. So try and keep the surface clean, but it's not possible to be perfect. So who cleans is another question. So when I first arrived, I showed them how I would suggest cleaning, that I would spray down the whole surface, make sure the whole surface was covered, and then wipe down with the paper towel. And I helped them clean when things got a little bit busier. and I was able to take that time to help them clean, but in general, they should be the ones who are cleaning. I could not stay at my polling location the entire time from 5 a.m. until 9 p.m., and so they need to take over if you can't stay the entire day. So it's good to have them clean and have you watch them and offer any advice that you have. And if you run out of supplies, think about that possibility. Try and measure the supplies that you're using, how often you're using them, because the supplies are going to be finite and you don't want to run out of them at 6 p.m. when everybody's coming off of work and starting to vote. Next slide, please. Okay, so since I'm an OSHA person as well, I do want to talk a little bit about other safety considerations, especially because of these cleaning solutions that are going to be sprayed frequently on the polling areas. So think about slips, trips, and falls. It might not come immediately to mind, but with some of these very thin solutions that are almost the quality of water, sometimes they may get everywhere and be difficult to fully clean up off the floor. So just be mindful that you check the floor area for areas that could be potential slip hazards. You also want to think about your door thresholds, your stairs if people have to go up those, entryways, and think about the weather. If it's raining, people may be walking in and tracking water. So be mindful of that. Maybe put down a runner or put a wet floor sign or something like that. You also want to think about evacuation because you are a kind of safety representative at that polling station, and the polling workers may be thinking more about the safety of the election, which is good because they're experts in that. They may not think about where do they go if the fire alarm goes off? What do they do in June if there's a shelter-in-place order, for example? So those are good issues to think about. And then think about also traffic if the line becomes long. This sounds like a strange issue, but because of COVID and we have to social distance, you might have seen some of those articles on the news with voters who were extending back for a half a mile, all waiting 6 feet apart, trying to vote at some locations around the country. So depending on your building and how the parking lot is laid out, this may be easier, but the building that I was at was right up against a major road. If we had very long lines, that major road could cause a problem. So before you get a giant rush of people, think about what are ways that you could extend the traffic safely with social distancing and with the possibility of cars being on the road right next to you. Next slide, please. Okay, food safety, I just wanted to touch on this one briefly too, because your workers need to eat. They're going to be there for 12 or 14 hours or longer. So they need to have a meal. And many times they're often used to potluck where they'll each bring in something and it's a good opportunity for them to have camaraderie and to hang out with each other. But prepared food in the case of COVID is ideal because if someone is ill or has an ill family member, they could bring a bowl that could have contamination on it. It's just ideal to get prepared food from outside. And these are things you can suggest to them. Again, we're not enforcement officers. We can't force anything on anyone, but we can certainly suggest these to the group. I would also suggest having one server instead of a buffet style where you could think of a box of pizza. Everyone opens up the box, you pull out your slice, and you maybe nudge the next slice. It's ideal instead to have one person with a mask on serving everyone. If they have food that they're touching directly, like pizza, it's probably a good idea for them to have gloves on. Or if it's something that they're kind of spooning or ladling out, then that could be something where they may not need gloves as urgently. And think about just like at a buffet style, one plate per trip. You don't want to have a plate that you ate off of and then you go back and put the spoon that everyone's using onto your plate to ladle more food on that. You don't want that. So you want to make sure that you only use one plate per trip, just like if you go to a buffet restaurant. Think about also disposable plates, utensils, napkins. You don't want somebody having to wash everything afterwards. And separate bottles or containers for drinks. So you don't want everybody drinking out of the same 2-liter bottle of soda. Everyone has to grab it and pour it. It's ideal if you have water bottles so that everybody can grab their own water bottle or their own can of soda instead of having one shared drink. And you want to wipe surfaces before and wipe surfaces after. And it's good to have hand sanitizer in the room too, because if you eat and then you go and touch something like the bottles of water, you may not think of, I should go wash my hands because I just ate. Especially if the bathroom is far away from your break room, people are not going to leave the room, use the restroom to wash their hands, and then come back every time they eat something. So it's good to have hand sanitizer around so people just remember, oh, I should probably wash my hands or cover my hands in something before I get something else. Next slide, please. And I touched on this a little bit, voters with special needs, so going out to the cars to help voters. This will vary by location, but walking to the cars is a good time to have a mask on, again, to set that precedent. And giving them the paperwork and the ballots on that clipboard. Think about what items should the voter be keeping, preferably as many as we can. What items should the polling worker take back, preferably only the ballot and the clipboard. And when can the worker wash their hands? If you have frequent people going out to their cars and you have mainly outside car voting, that may be a different scenario for when workers end up washing their hands. Maybe they only wash their hands on break, or they keep one clean hand, whatever they need to do. Think about when the ideal time for them to take a break, take off any gloves they have, and wash their hands is. And then also think about maintaining distance while someone's at the car. You could potentially coach your workers that they should hand the ballot and then step back a little bit, because it is difficult to maintain social distancing while talking to someone through a car, but it can be done. So again, you can't enforce any of this. You can't force this on anyone, but you can try and coach your workers because they are interested in staying safe. And the workers, since they're sitting near each other all day or sitting in the same room all day, may be higher risk than the voters themselves, who are only passing through for 2 or 3 minutes sometimes. So the workers generally are interested, at least in my experience, in staying safe. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly is demobilization. So we're all used to packing up tables and chairs and all standing next to each other while we stack the chairs, but we need to think about social distancing while we're cleaning up as well. So think about what surfaces you can wipe down. This is a great time for those wipes. And you can coach people on demobilization even if you're not going to be there for that time. And think about what can and can't be cleaned. You can't clean those paper ballots. They should not be tampered with. So the person who's going to be handling those paper ballots that come out of the machine, because I believe it's the chief that actually takes the ballots out of the machine and packages them in a certain way, that person needs to be aware that those papers were touched by people and they should be washing their hands, avoiding touching their face while they're handling those ballots. So that's all I have for today. I will stick around, and anyone who has any questions, feel free to put them in chat. But I'll hand this over to Jennifer Freeland to finish up our presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Adrenia, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you clearly.
Excellent. So a lot of good questions in chat. The other Jennifer, good night, and I'm sure there was a lot of glove questions in chat. So I think maybe how about the whole glove discussion we kind of put off to the side, and then after I'm done, Jennifer, good night, can you kind of compile what would be your responses to the glove conversation? And we'll get back on to answer those, because I think that they probably need a little bit more, it would be better verbally than in the chat box. So
no problem. It's a tough question. I'll definitely look at all the chats, and at the end we can talk more about gloves.
Super. So I've seen a lot of, what are we going to be doing? Who are we really? So we are public health champions, and we're not officers of public health. We're not mask officers. We're not hand washing officers. We are there to observe, advise, and encourage individuals to do the right behavior. And there are some, Jessica talked about, that we can't require people to wear masks when they come in, that they're going to be able to come in regardless if they're wearing a mask or not. But we want to encourage them to do so. I had spoken to a volunteer who did the election in May, and she was in Franklin. She did a full day shift, so she did from beginning to end at her own desire. And she said, I had a police officer come in, and he wasn't wearing a mask, and he didn't have his ID. And he said, I gotta go get my ID. And I very nicely said, gee, officer, do you happen to have a mask in your car? Well, yeah, I do. Well, when you come back, would you mind wearing that? And she said, he kind of like, well, yeah, I guess so. So I think we're really there to be a coach. A lot of these behaviors are new for everyone. And I know some of the public, nurses and doctors and, you know, a lot of the safety folks like Jennifer, this is, you know, common to them. Wearing a mask while you work is normal, but for most of us, it's not. I mean, I'm here at my house and I don't wear a mask at home. So, you know, it is more of a coaching role. We're not there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to interact. So I just think I wanted to set that aside so that we know that we're not officers and enforcing anything. You're really there to represent the Virginia Department of Health and the Virginia Medical Reserve Corps program. So you're our public health champion. We have a very limited staff at VDH. I asked yesterday HR, we have about 3,500 employees at the Virginia Department of Health. We have 18,000 volunteers. If you guys can help us get this message out, that is way more than we could ever do with our 3,500 voices. You are out there to be our voices and our representation to the community. We love that we have community members that are willing to be invested in their community health. And that's what we think is valuable about having our MRC program for this initiative as public health infection ambassadors. So we want for you to give a professional representation of yourselves, of VDH and MRC. I've worn today our Virginia MRC COVID-19 t-shirt. We have bought thousands of these t-shirts. We hope that everyone wears one of these on election day. Definitely get with your MRC unit coordinator if you don't have one. We'll make sure you get one. You should also have a badge. I personally have like hand sanitizer on my badge, which I absolutely love. And so you should have a badge. Everybody have lanyards. Most of the unit coordinators, we're getting brand new lanyards. They'll be navy blue lanyards because my white one looks quite dirty. So we went with navy blue for our new lanyards, and we are doing new badges. Hopefully those will be out by the 23rd as well. So we want you to wear your shirt, your badge, your lanyard. Definitely, you know, you probably are going to be standing for long periods of time, so we want you to be comfortable. So wear a good pair of shoes. You know, if you're a nurse, you're probably putting on those clogs or a good pair of tennis shoes, whatever is going to keep you comfortable during the day. More than likely, you will be walking around. I'm sure that there'll be opportunities for you to sit down as well. But we are there to, you know, have conversations with the workers and provide them with encouragement. Please, you know, wear slacks, shorts that are in good order, you know, no torn, ripped jeans or anything like that. I know that's the style for some of us that, some of you that are younger, but we just ask that you refrain from being as in style with ripped clothing as you're representing us for this response. Okay, I'll take next slide, please. All right, so interacting with election officials and the chief. So we've had thank you for our MRC volunteers that are also election officials, because they've been giving us some really great answers in the chat box. They're perfect. The chief will resolve issues. So if you have a problem, you know, a worker's kind of not being really responsive, you need to go to the chief and let the chief know. It is my understanding that Department of Elections has communicated to all the workers that they have to wear masks or they have to wear face shields, preferably mask and face shields if those are available. But, you know, at minimum, they should be wearing a face shield if they can't tolerate a mask. So they are the ones who obtain the resources. So if the supplies are not available and you notice that you need more paper towels or cleaning solution, things like that, definitely let the chief know if there's issues so they can take care of that. And then if there is, and I'm going to talk about media, but if there is any need to interact with the media, handle any situation, that's the chief. So for those of you that are familiar with our ICS structure, incident command structure, right? Most of you have taken 100 or have participated in exercises where we've done the ICS structure. You can kind of think about your position as an MRC volunteer being the safety officer in the ICS structure. Take the officer part off. We're the safety advisor. ambassador. And your chief is kind of like, the chief, the incident commander for the, event there at your poll. So look at that chain of command as that structure. If the chief decides to assign you somebody else to liaison with, please do that. But otherwise, they are really the ones there to make the final decisions. If you don't agree with the chief's decision, they're the chief, and their decision is final. So we just have to provide information and encouragement, and hopefully be able to keep everyone healthier as they are able to submit their vote on the 23rd. So I'll take the next slide, please, Adria. So when you interact with the voters, we are encouraging, we are not enforcing. And, hey, we're asking people to wear masks. If you don't have one, we have some over here for you. And if some of the locations might have masks, and they'll make them available to voters. That's probably not always the case, because obviously that might be a significant amount of masks, but they might have some donated, or locality might have decided to provide some, which would be great. And so you could provide them to them. And the voters, maybe they don't know how to put the mask on, and so you could actually instruct them on how to properly put on the mask, like Jennifer did previously. This is an opportunity for us to coach to this new, temporary, till we get vaccine, way of living and setting that new social norm. So really, I think everybody needs to be encouraged and reminded. I don't think we've set a whole bunch of new rules, or, and we all know everything changes with new CDC guidance, with new executive orders, and it's a lot to keep up with. So I think that it's really hard for us to even think about enforcing something when we're just learning the behavior itself, right? We also want you to be able to answer public health questions. So if you're a nurse and you're very comfortable answering some basic public health questions, or you're a healthcare professional, a medical student, feel free. But always refer people to the most updated information about COVID-19 to our website, where they can get that information, and they can also ask questions there. There's the COVID symptom checker that is on the website. And then for anybody looking for testing opportunities, that's on the website. There's actually an option, and you can put in your zip code and find testing available. So we do want to direct the public back to those locations, those sources of information. You aren't expected to be the source of information about COVID. Neither am I. I'm not an epidemiologist. We have some really fantastic leaders at BDH that are the subject matter experts. So please encourage them to go back to resources that are accurate and are maintained current. We'll take the next slide. So interacting with the media. I doubt, especially for June, since the media don't seem to be as engaged right now because of social distancing, that we'll have media coming up and asking questions. But one, refer them back to the chief. But if they do, and you're walking in, somebody sees you wearing your shirt, maybe it's at a different location, and they ask you, oh, hey, you're wearing this MRC shirt. It says, Virginia MRC COVID-19. If any of you have taken the orientation that I have taken and provided and been online, that I encourage you to, one, if you're at a location where there's a public information officer, so say you're at a testing event, you refer the media to the public information officer. Given that there won't be a PIO at this facility, you're going to either refer them to the chief, or you would refer them back to the Mrc Unit Coordinator. You can refer them to our website to find the Mrc Coordinator's contact information. If you don't have that off the top of your head, it's just VAMRC.org. And all of the Mrc Unit Coordinator information is there, as well as our generic email address that we monitor very, very closely. So you can say, I'd be happy to do an interview, but I want to make sure you get the right information and it's well coordinated. Let me get you to the right person. We're more than happy and would love to be able to coordinate interviews, and we do. actually, I've done 2 media interviews this week. And one had 2 additional volunteers on that interview with me. So we do facilitate that, and would love to have the opportunity to have some of our infection prevention ambassador volunteers contribute in some of those ways for some presentations or interview opportunities. So we want to make sure you're prepared and we connect everybody and we stay informed. We often have to get approval from our Department of Communications and even the governor's office when we do media avails and provide interviews. So we just want to make sure we stay in that chain of command. All right, next slide. So with your MRC Unit Coordinator, you should have appointed one. Everybody should know who their MRC Unit Coordinator is. If you don't, go to VA MRC and find out your contact information or email us. I'm sure Laura Cash is in the chat box too. Laura is our program assistant. She's my other right hand. She's fantastic, and our email address, Laura is the one who answers all our generic questions. So if you have any problems, you can email our generic email account and we'll be able to get you where you need to go. So you might be interacting with your MRC Unit Coordinator, the one that you know as your unit coordinator. We do have some regional MRC Unit Coordinators. So out in the Southwest, Pat Menon is the Western Region MRC Coordinator, and he's been leading a lot of the Infection Prevention Ambassador volunteer coordination deployment activities out there. So you might be interacting with Pat, or you might have gotten alert communications from Pat. Your MRC Unit Coordinator might have a county captain or an MRC volunteer that's going to be leading a specific health district or locality. So you might be interacting with another volunteer. So just know that you should know who your supervisor is and how to contact them and liaison with them to let them know if you're unavailable, to make it and to be on time, so that we can try to find someone else to fill in with your position, or the election official will know whether or not you will be arriving. We will provide them with your information and say, this is the MRC IPA that you can expect to be there with you in the morning and in the afternoon, and they will be there to work with you. Someone had asked me before about shift lengths. So they have asked for, most localities have asked for 5 a.m. to 7. And most of the unit coordinators have broken that up into 2 shifts. I think one coordinator has broken it up into 3. You should be getting your alert in the Virginia Volunteer Health System, and in that alert, you should choose whether or not you want to do the morning or the afternoon. And when you do that, make those selections, that'll put you in the assignment for that location. So your unit coordinator will confirm which location you've been assigned to and which shift that you have been assigned. We would love pictures. I don't have any pictures of volunteers doing elections from May. I would love some for June. So if you're into picture taking, take some pictures with your poll workers. You can send them to us, post them on Facebook, send them to your MRC Unit Coordinator, because I would love to share them on our page, our Virginia Medical Reserve Corps page. Just to let you know that Virginia statewide, this is the first, the only one in the nation that we know of that has partnered with the state agency for elections to mobilize this many volunteers for election day. And we are the model, and I hope that we pilot it so well that all the MRC units across the nation and many MRC units will be supporting our November election. So everything that we learn, all the information that we share from this deployment is only going to make us better in November, but it's also going to make the MRC unit across the nation better, because we're going to share all of our great work with them. And I think that that's really exciting. So go ahead, I'll take the next slide. My slides are up in the right-hand corner. Yeah. Okay, so what is your responsibility? One, we want to make sure you sign in and sign out for your shift. So make sure you report that you're there. Let us know if you can't show. So if you go in the morning, someone said, oh, well, what am I going to do? Well, if you're coming in the morning, we are going to have a checklist, and it's going to be posted on the website, and we're going to give you some more specific tools. So, but a lot of the guidance that Jennifer spoke about of opening doors and making sure there's airflow, there'll be kind of a checklist. So if you're first in the morning, you're going to be going through that day of, and if you're at the end of the day, then you're going to be doing the closing up. Now, if you get there in the middle of the day, what we want you to do, and you're handing it over from one volunteer to the other, we're going to have that checklist and with the notes section so that the morning IPA can make some notes and suggestions, and then the afternoon IPA can learn from what the morning IPA did. So hopefully you'll have the opportunity to just do a quick debrief. Hey, this is what we've done. We've made these changes. You know, it looks like we might get some thunderstorms this afternoon. This was the plan that we discussed, but as the day went on, you know, I'm thinking you might want to make these suggestions. Or, hey, one of the workers, you know, he doesn't get up and wash his hands as much, and looks like he sits there for a long period of time. Maybe if you have the opportunity, I've encouraged him a couple times to why don't he take a break. So, you know, that's just somebody you might want to keep an eye on. So definitely do that kind of nice handoff to your next IPA volunteer so that they have a sense of operations and things that have been going on and what they can anticipate happening during their shift. So that's important. Make sure you know who to check in with. Like I said, who your point of contact will be, either your MRC Unit Coordinator, your Regional Coordinator, your lead for your MRC, your volunteer lead. But we're, and most of our MRC units are going to be using a Google survey to check in and check out. So you'll be able to go in and tell us, I got here at this time, I left here at this time. And there'll be like about 5 questions that you'll be able to answer about, yes, I got the information I needed, or I had issues, or I didn't have PPE. So you'll be able to answer all of that, so that, again, that's a way to check in, so that we can document your deployment in VVHS, but also a way that you can provide us with feedback. And that's you know, something that we want. Your unit coordinator might say, text me when you get there, text me when you leave, or they might just ask you to send an email and let you know. We're going to try to go for that Google survey because it's going to enable us to harness a lot of information. So we have a request for right now for over 68 localities that have asked for infection prevention ambassadors, and that's over 1,100 volunteers. So there's going to be 1,100 IPAs at polls on the 23rd, which I think is very exciting because I don't think we've ever had a deployment with over 1,000 volunteers on the same day. So that's really, you know, that's really exciting. We'll go next slide. Okay. So we talked about quite a few things. Purposes of MRC volunteers and elections. Operations, Jessica did a good job going over that. We talked about expectations, your role, all the different strategies for infection prevention and tools, who to communicate with, and then your volunteer responsibilities. So, you know, I know that this isn't every single little thing. Jessica and Jennifer went over definitely Jessica went over the big picture in operations. And I see that there's been a lot of conversations in the chat, especially about the photo pictures without a signed photo release. Yes, you can do a group shot with MRC members. You can go outside the polling location. You can do a solo selfie. We do have, if you signed up as an MRC volunteer, you consented to the use of your photo. So I won't put any pictures on Facebook unless you give it to me. And we have that you've consented for use of the photo on Facebook. If the poll workers are willing, you've got buddy, and you know, they're willing to take a picture with you and you share it and y'all are friends on Facebook now, great. Y'all can, you know, you can work that out if you put it on your personal Facebook page. But that's what we do for volunteers. You know, even so, I mean, just like with elections, we're not allowed to put any faces of patients and pictures, you know, for HIPAA reasons. So the same thing applies for polling. So yeah, there are, you know, different regulations that we have to follow, but you know, the Virginia Facebook profile picture is me in my mask with 2 MRC volunteers, and we were at a testing event. So you can do something similar as that as well. Or even if an MRC unit coordinator or somebody else slides by and they can stage a photo of, you doing your job, that would be great. So I think that we'll go ahead and, oh wait, next slide, Adrenia. We do have a couple more slides. So this is the resource site that I've mentioned a couple times. The slides from this presentation are already posted there as PDFs, so you can pull those down. We do have an infection prevention ambassador job action sheet and checklist. That should be up by Tuesday. I've got it in final draft right now, so that'll be there. A recording of this presentation will be there. The video that elections was provided is also going to be there, and actually I'll include the great interview and media spot that was done there as well. So there'll be a lot of different resources for you to review. And next slide. All right, so most importantly, thank you for volunteering. We are so busy. Thank you for volunteering for elections, for being an IPA. I see that this is the start of a very big mission for us. Infection prevention, of course, is the heart of public health and what we do. And I already see that we are doing infection prevention in our long-term care facilities and trying to reduce the amount of outbreaks in the long-term care facilities, not necessarily in the role as an IPA, but doing encouragement and training on how to properly wear PPE. Some of our MRC volunteers have become PPE fit testers for N95 masks, which we need a strong core of fit testers. And so I see now that we have our opening of schools, I've had a lot of conversations yesterday and Thursday about the need for infection prevention in schools and just the ambassadors to spread the message of how to wash your hands properly, take gloves on, how to wear a mask. So if this is really something at your heart and you've done this and you say, wow, I really found this very rewarding, I foresee that we'll be doing like an IPA for schools and an IPA for long-term care facilities. And that will take this mission of reducing infections and maintaining a healthier community and protecting our health to a lot of different areas, even outside of elections. So I'm very excited about that. I hope that you'll have a great time on June 23rd and that you'll have such a good time you'll decide to do it again in November. So thank you for being here, for joining us, and for sharing all of your expertise, your knowledge, and your time. Especially thank Jennifer Goodnight and Pam, who helped to put the presentation together and worked on the checklist, and Chris Reaney, our Near Southwest MRC coordinator, who got interviewed but also helped us develop the content. It really has been a team effort. Now don't leave yet, so go to the next page, Adrenia. So we want to make sure that we know that you are here. And I know some of you got in train, some of you didn't get in train, but how we're going to verify that you were here today is please send an email to training@vamrc.org and in the subject say I am an IPA and include your first name and your last name. And when you do that, Adrenia is going to go and document your training in the Virginia Volunteer Health System or in Train, so it is in your profile in the Virginia Volunteer Health System, so that we know that the volunteers that we are assigning to the IPA positions have completed this training and also have access to the information regarding this position. So that is all I have to add. I'll ask if Veronica, if we can open up Laura's line, and if she has any last questions. Actually, why don't we go ahead and let Jennifer, while you're finding Laura, let Jennifer Goodnight address the glove
Yes. Yeah, so I took a look through all the chats that came in during my presentation. And there were some concerns about, not changing your gloves every time you hold someone's license, or not washing your hands or using hand sanitizer every time you use someone's license. And I completely agree. Ideally, every time you touch something, it would be a great time to wash your hands. But unfortunately, we have to balance the speed of getting people through the polling stations. So there are different ways to handle that. One is to clean surfaces very often. I suggest wash your hands as often as you can. But for the polling workers, it just may not be possible for them to wash their hands or use hand sanitizer every time, because you have to balance the fact that if you have too many people waiting, now you might have a social distancing risk. So the way that we approach risk in OSHA and with other potential infection risk is you can never reduce the risk down to zero. You want to reduce the risk down to as much as feasibly possible. And given our limited supplies, given our need to be able to allow voters to vote in a reasonable amount of time to maintain social distancing and be aware of traffic in the local areas, try and keep those balances in mind. And you also cannot watch the workers every moment, especially if you're not serving the whole shift, which you won't be. You can't watch them every moment. Your goal is to coach them and help them be aware so that they are less likely to, touch their nose and then grab someone's license and hand it back to them, so that they're more likely to say, I need to go on a break, I'm going to wash my hands, go on my break, wash my hands again and come back, or I'm going to use hand sanitizer because I haven't for a few minutes. Hand sanitizers, even with their additives, can be somewhat damaging on hands. If we might have hundreds of people going through one polling station. So if that worker needs to use hand sanitizer hundreds of times a day, not only will we run out of hand sanitizer, but that may cause breakouts in their hands over time, which again increases infection risk. So it is a balance. People also asked about hand sanitizer on gloves, and currently this is not suggested, because if you use hand sanitizer on gloves, you can potentially damage your gloves integrity, and that you necessarily can't really guarantee that the glove's protecting you anymore. However, we're not really using gloves in the way that a nurse or a doctor might be using gloves in order to deal with a patient. We're using gloves to help remind us not to touch our face. So just a reminder here, gloves are not required for when you're handling license, but they're a good way to tell people, hey, this license has been touched by a voter. Make sure you wash your hands as often as you can. Make sure that you're aware of the fact that you're touching items that may be contaminated if someone is sick. And then the other thing I wanted to address is people talked about putting up the license up, or the identification up to the plastic barrier. That may work. If you have shower curtains or something instead, that may not work. I asked at my polling location if we could do that, and they said that they did not want to for their election reasons. And so I want you to be prepared for both possibilities. But yes, that is a great idea. Have people hold their own ID up. Again, be aware of the fact that if everybody's touching the same plastic barrier, you will need to wipe that down. So I wish I could say there was a perfect way that everyone could wash their hands after every single interaction. But unfortunately, because of time concerns, that just really becomes difficult for us to do and or enforce. Let me check and make sure that addressed everything. Yes, hand washing, people also mentioned, is always the best option. Hand washing is better than hand sanitizer. But hand sanitizer is, again, something else to make you aware. Preferably, if you use hand sanitizer to get through a couple more moments, eventually you go wash your hands for real after that. And as far as gloves, make sure you take the gloves off properly, but you also want to wash your hands after you use gloves every time. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the spray cleaners. So people mentioned that the spray cleaners sometimes need a contact time, and that is true. However, the best thing that you can do is scrub. So yes, ideally, if we had some kind of alcohol-based cleaner, we could let it sit there for 10 minutes. But again, that may not be feasible. So when you wash your hands, when you use soap, you're not actually required to use any kind of soap that has antibacterial anything properties in order to get things off your hands. Hand washing works because of the friction and because of the scrubbing. Soap is designed the way that it is because it encourages you to do scrubbing. And so that's why they tell you to cover every part of your hands and to scrub each part. So it's the same way with your polling station, with the place where the voter is voting. If you're scrubbing that solution off, you're cleaning that station. And ideally, you want to have a chemical in there like alcohol to make sure that you're scrubbing with alcohol. But if you scrub hard enough, even soap and water is great. So of course, we want to use the cleaning solutions, but I just wanted to remind you all that the scrubbing part is what is ideal. And that's what you want to keep in mind and what you want to coach people on as far as cleaning. So I think that addressed most of the questions that came in. Oh, people wanted to talk about the 1 versus 2 gloves again. yes, there are concerns that if somebody puts only one glove on, they may contaminate their other hand. But keep in mind, we're not trying to be perfect. We're just trying to reduce risk. We're trying to reduce the possibility that someone puts contamination on their face. And so depending on how you judge it or how your workers judge it when you're out of there for the day, they may choose to wear one glove. They may choose to wear two gloves. They may choose to not use gloves and just think more about hand washing. All of those choices are possible answers as long as people are aware of how they can potentially get contamination on their hands, how that can end up on their face and in their body. That's the concepts they need to be aware of. But there's no rules for you must wear one glove in this circumstance and two gloves in this and no gloves in this. That's going to be dictated by your supplies, your judgment, their judgment, and education. So your goal as an IPA is to educate them and help make them aware so that they can reduce their risk as much as possible, but it's never going to be perfect. So I hope that answered some of the questions. People asked about cloths being okay. Yes, since you're doing that scrubbing, if you have microfiber cloths or something like that instead of paper towels are nicer because they're disposable. But again, with the scrubbing, yes, that's okay, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to use a hand towel when washing our hands at home. It's a similar principle. So Jennifer, I hope that answered most of the things that came in. I will check the chat again to make sure, but I just wanted to clarify some of those points.
And there's a lot of good cleaning discussion and questions. Wiping down the door. Yes, I mean, always. If people are using the door handles need to be wiped, or that one person needs to be the only person that's touching the door and opening and closing the door if that's possible. So definitely with that. We talked about cleaning solution, but it is not your role as the IPA to be doing the cleaning. That is responsible of the workers at the polling station. You're there to encourage them to use the cleaning solution correctly, to show them how you should clean, let it dry, just like Jennifer was talking about. But it's not your job between every poll voter to go in there and wipe down that booth. We should encourage them to do so, but I know even in one of the IPAs we spoke to, maybe it was Pam, so the cleaning solution was so strong that the fumes were just starting to drive everybody nuts because they were using like something from a distillery and the alcohol smell is very strong. So I think even then you have to balance the trying to reduce risk and still be able to breathe through your mask with cleaning fumes in there. It's not going to be perfect, right? I think that's the thing. It's not going to be a surgical suite. We're just trying to make it better. And how can what are some smart things that we can do to reduce risk? And that's what we're there to educate and encourage, so that we try to make sure that we can accomplish that for the workers and also for everybody that's coming in there to vote. And that really is the bottom line. So, Laura, we're over time. Are there any burning questions that I need to answer in the chat box? Where do you stand? Like, we walk around, talk to your chief. They'll tell you where they think it's appropriate for you to be or not be at the site and the location. Really, they're going to be the one that provides you with the instructions on what you can and can't do and where they don't want you to be. So they'll let you know. Okay. The burning question, the mask and shield mandated for all officials. Yes, I've been told that they are. So I will get a final on that from Jessica Bowman, and we will put that on the IPA site and say, this is the Department of Elections formal, word on who is required to wear masks or face shields. All right.
Jennifer, I saw one quick question about food. It is not our job to be the one who is serving food. It's our job to just educate them that, hey, think about this if you all are grabbing lunch together. Think about sitting far apart. Think about you can't wear your masks when you're eating, and think about how to serve the food if you are going for shared food as opposed to people bringing their lunches. Just bring these people's attention to these issues.
So yes, you do not clean the surfaces. If you want to offer to do that, that's fine, but that's not your responsibility. I know one volunteer said it was kind of bothering them that people weren't cleaning they didn't have enough people to be able to clean the voting booths as often as they would like, so they took it upon themselves to do the cleaning. So yes, if you want to help, go ahead, but that's not your responsibility. And we've told elections that we are not a cleaning company. We are there to encourage. Yes, the officials do have a better understanding of what the MRC is there for. We have a request process, and that's been communicated to them. So I think that's much improved. I mean, May was a flurry of let's just see if we can do this. So obviously we've become a little bit more finessed in putting the information together and bringing all of our subject matter experts. So I think it'll go more smoothly in June than it did in May. Not that we had many hiccups, but there were a couple of hiccups, but I think that they've been resolved. So, yep, use your common sense and stay healthy. It's all good. And we are going to put a Q&A. We'll take actually all the questions from this chat and we'll put them up in Q&A so anybody can go in and look at those. So thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us. I got to do a Facebook Live. I'm 3 minutes late. So come over and talk to me in Facebook Live, everyone. Thanks. Bye.